So I realized that the content that I put on my YouTube channel isn't really much except for straightforward movie reviews. I think what I should do a little more is maybe have more of these kind of discussion videos. If I kind of have something on my mind about movies, then I'll kind of try to discuss it more on video. So I saw The Conjuring again today. If you saw my review, you know that I absolutely fucking loved it. One of my favorite horror movies of all time now. And seeing it again kind of made me want to make a video about something that's been on my mind recently. So if you're the average film fan or the average moviegoer and you have a decent amount of knowledge about current films and past films, you'd probably think that horror movies now are a lot worse than they were, 30 to 40 years ago. I mean, basically the general consensus is that, horror is kind of dead and there are rarely any good horror movies where, there are so many classics from the 80s and 70s. And I mean, that's what I used to think, because I looked back and saw all these horror classics and they all came out, like 30 years ago. And then I go see, the newest horror movie that comes out this week and of course it's shit. I mean, I've been thinking about this and, watching older horror movies and watching current horror movies. And after thinking about it, I think I'd refute the statement that horror movies are worse now than they were before. So when you think classic horror movies, what do you think of? You think of The Exorcist, you think of The Shining, you think of Halloween, you think of Psycho, you think of The Omen. And when did all these horror movies come out? They came out, in the 70s and 80s and 60s. Sure, when those movies came out, they scared the hell out of people. People were shitting their pants in the theaters. People, I think, had heart attacks during The Exorcist. But when you look back on those movies and watch them again, is anyone really that scared of them anymore? In fact, go back and watch those classic horror movies. Are you actually that terrified when you watch them again? And trust me, The Shining and The Exorcist are two of my favorite movies of all time. The Shining is my favorite horror movie of all time. But they don't really scare me as much as I just find them mesmerizing to look at and find them just absolutely really well directed. I can watch those movies and not be truly terrified, really. And I've actually found that the horror movies that do still really terrify me and make me not be able to sleep at night are the more recent ones. Just recently, The Conjuring and Insidious and last year's Sinister and The Strangers. Yes, The Strangers. These are the movies that have, just absolutely great imagery that scares the shit out of me and that just sticks in my mind. The use of music in these movies, especially Insidious and The Strangers, just sticks in my mind and I just can't listen to them after dark. And I know a lot of you are probably going to say, but what about all these awful movies that come out, every week? Because, yes, most of the horror movies that come out now aren't scary. Most of the horror movies that I see are not scary in the slightest and kind of suck. Most of the ones about paranormal shit and, ghosts are just the worst things you can ever experience and will make you want to shoot yourself. And you'd be correct when you say one of the reasons for this is because once something gets popular, like Paranormal Activity started a trend of, even more found footage movies and ghost shit. And, whenever something like that gets popular, there are just a ton of retreads that just come pouring out and none of them are scary. But if you think this is new for horror movies and if you think it just happens now and didn't happen before, you are dead wrong. Friday the 13th, was and still is an immensely popular horror movie that isn't scary. I really like it. I like all the sequels that everyone hates. I'm a big fan of the Friday the 13th movies. They're not scary, though. They're entertaining, but not scary. And the popularity of Friday the 13th spawned several new slasher movies, all based on a certain holiday, and they're all the same thing. They're all killers going around and just stabbing different people, or just whatever, just killing them in different methods. So many of these slasher movies came out in the 80s, and pretty much none of them are scary at all. Most of them are pretty damn awful that I've seen, and I'm saying that, these movies came out every other week. There are so many that probably got a lot of money back then, and a lot of teenagers loved and were scared of, and are just fucking awful. You can look at the critical response to most horror movies that come out these days. Most of them are negative, as were the horror movies that came out in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of them were classics. When Psycho came out, everyone hated it. The critical response to it was terrible. Friday the 13th, that was considered one of the worst movies ever. It was nominated for a Razzie. Horror movies made a lot of money. No critics liked them. But it's the same thing with the horror movies back in the 70s and 80s. The only ones I can think of that did get a good critical response were Halloween, The Exorcist. Really not much more. And I think that a lot of horror directors nowadays are a lot smarter than a lot of the ones back then. Like, I mean, if you watch a slasher movie, what fucking techniques are used in those that really scare you? It's the same damn thing over and over again. People being killed. No, there's like no good imagery in them. Nothing that will stay in your mind. It's just fun to watch. But I think a lot of horror directors nowadays, in particular James Wan, they really know how to create really great suspense and really great imagery. I keep saying imagery because I mean that's a key factor. If you see Insidious, if you see The Strangers, if you see, The Conjuring, you know that great imagery is really what sticks in your mind and creeps you the hell out. Music that sticks in your head. The score from Insidious is one of the scariest things ever. And I think there's a lot more that can be done now that they could do back in the 70s. I mean, please, just try watching any horror movie from the 70s and tell me if you're really, truly scared. I mean, please, don't put on The Exorcist and say, oh, see, scary, because obviously The Exorcist is scary. But I mean, just take an average, slightly famous horror movie that came out in that time period. I bet you that you're not going to be scared whatsoever. So all in all, yes, most horror movies that come out these days are shitty. Most of the horror movies that come out these days aren't scary. Most horror movies these days are just trying to captivate on the success of a previous really popular horror film. But it's not anything new.